Okay. Okay. Well, good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone, and welcome. I am Beverly Scott, the founder of Introducing Youth to American Infrastructure, IYA. And on behalf of our board of directors and entire team, we are so glad that you're here. I want to start with a simple question. When was the last time that you took a bus, a subway, a light rail, a ferry, a commuter train? For some of you, that was this morning. For others, maybe it's been a while. And for some of our young people and some others joining us today, public transit may be the only way you get to school, to work, to a doctor's appointment, to a future that you are trying to reach. Here is what I want you to hold on to as we have this conversation today. Public transportation is not a service for people who have no other choice. It is infrastructure for everyone. It connects workers to jobs, students to schools, seniors to care, and communities to each other. And when it works well, everyone benefits, including people who never step on a bus. And when it is underfunded, when service gets cut, when fares go up, when routes disappear from neighborhoods that need them most, the consequences are not abstract. They fall on real people in real time in ways that are often invisible to those of us with other options. And it is exactly for this reason that we are here today. Because how does public transportation actually get paid for? Who decides how much? Who decides where the money goes? And why? Why? Despite all we know about how essential this infrastructure is, does the funding always seem to be in crisis? These are not simple questions. They involve federal dollars, state formulas, local ballot measures, fair revenue, fuel taxes, and debates about who should pay more for a service that benefits everyone but is used by some more than others. So don't feel alone today and for our next session as well, that will be next week. Most people, including many elected officials, do not fully understand how this system works. It's not a criticism. It is genuinely complicated. And that is exactly why today's conversation matters. And it is exactly why we have the right person to help us navigate it. In a moment, Alexandra Martin, a chemistry major and graduating senior with honors from Grambling State University, and a recipient of one of our 2026 Community Builder Fellowships, named in honor of our late founding board member, Dr. Juanita Jones Abernathy, will give Dr. Agrawal the full introduction she deserves. What I will say is this: she has spent more than 25 years asking hard questions about transportation funding. Not just how the money flows, but whether it is fair, whether it is sustainable, and whether the public actually understands and supports the choices being made on their behalf. That combination of rigor and relevance is rare, and we are fortunate to have her with us. I will also say, because it matters to what IYA does, that Dr. Agrawal's work is guided by a commitment to equity and sustainability. And that really, really matters. So with that, she asked who gets served, who gets left out, and what do the funding choices we make today say about the communities we are trying to build? That is our kind of conversation. Alexandra, would you please do us the honor of introducing our distinguished guest?
Yes, I can. Hello, everyone. I hope you all are having a wonderful afternoon. I am Alexandra Martin, and in this year, I'll be serving as a Community Builder Fellow for IYA. And I have the pleasure of introducing to you guys Dr. Asha Weinstein Argawal, who will be our presenter today. Dr. Agarwal is an education director at the Moneta Transportation Institute and a professor of urban and regional planning at San Jose State University. Her work centers on sustainability and equity, with the focus on how communities can use policy and planning strategies to promote environmentally responsible choices and improve access to underserved populations. While much of her research is connected to transportation, particularly in understanding travel behavior and public policy, her broader goal is to help create more inclusive and sustainable communities. She has published over 100 scholarly works and has led or contributed to research projects that have secured more than $3 million in funding. Her work is widely recognized and has been featured in major media outlets, reflecting her influence on current policy discussions. In addition to her academic work, Dr. Agrawal serves on several national and regional advisory boards and committees where she contributes her expertise to ongoing policies and planning efforts. She earned her BA from Harvard University and SC from London School of Economics and Political Science, and a PhD from the University of California in Berkeley. I would like for you guys to please pay close attention as I give Dr. Agrawal the opportunity to explain more about what she does in transportation and gives us a distinguished presentation on what this does for our community.
Well, thank you both Alexandra and Dr. Scott for those introductions. I wish you could have you introduce me for everything I do. Let me, excuse me, I have some slides, so let me just share those. Hopefully you're all seeing that. I know we are going to try and make this interactive. If you have questions, I believe you can put them into the chat. And I have designed my sort of conversation with you today into what I'm calling 3 acts. And I am happy to stop and chat about each of them in turn after I finish. I'll start, and this will be the briefest portion, to talk a little bit about transportation careers. So both how I got to where I am and also about a graduate program in transportation management that some of you might be interested in. I'm the director of that program. And then I'm going to turn to talking about gas taxes and whether they're how we replace them as our vehicles stop burning as much gas fuel. So I'm calling that from turnpikes to fuel taxes to the phantom toll booth, equity, sustainability, and the future of road pricing. We can stop and have a chat after that. And then my last piece today gets to public transit. And in particular, looking at the history of how we pay for public transit in the US and some of the important questions that our communities need to be thinking about right now. So let me get started with my first topic. So how did I get here today? And I would say that I'm a good example of somebody who discovered my career. My sense from lots of chit chat with people in the industry is that there are a few of us who grew up, we loved trains or cars or buses, and we always knew we wanted to be in transportation, but most of us don't sort of plot our way strategically to get into a transportation career. We fall into it. So I actually started with my undergraduate degree in folklore and mythology. I was interested in fairy tales, and but I did take a lot of social science classes. And while I was an undergraduate, I discovered urban planning. I had never heard of it, and I was taking a class that frankly I hated on the art of Michelangelo. And as the professor was lecturing one day, he put up a slide that showed a central plaza with a grand staircase and 3 buildings around it. And I still remember sitting there in that lecture hall thinking, oh, somebody thinks more than one building at a time. And on my weekly phone call with my parents, because that's when it was still very expensive to make long distance calls, they mentioned a couple of books that I might enjoy with my discovery of urban planning. They were The Social Life of Small Urban Spaces by William White and History of Cities by Lewis Mumford. And I read those and thought, wow, that's fascinating. And I love cities and exploring them. So I think I want to do urban planning. So I actually went to London on the London School of Economics, where I did my master's in city and regional planning. I wasn't at all specialized, although I did do my master's thesis on government policy to promote electric vehicles. But that was just kind of I don't even remember how I chose that. I then thought it would be fun to go from one enormous global city, London, to another one, New York. And I was lucky enough to get hired to work in the New York City Parks Department for a year, which was a wonderful introduction to public service, working for local government and planning and just New York City as a whole. It was a great experience. But by then I grew up in Berkeley, California. I had decided my parents weren't so bad and maybe I could go back to California. And Berkeley was kind of a good university. So I ended up going to get my PhD in urban and regional planning. And when I was applying, I asked the student advisor, are there any scholarships? And she said, no. Oh, well, the only students that get any money are the transportation students. So, and again, I was just being strategic. It was nothing more. I went home and I wrote my essay about how I longed to be a professor of transportation planning. And I was accepted. I did get 1 year scholarship, which, was sort of, typical at the time. And one thing led to another. It did take me 7 years, but I graduated and was lucky enough to get a job right away at San Jose State University, where I, as you heard, am a professor of urban planning and also work very closely with the Minetta Transportation Institute in a number of different capacities. So let me now turn. All of you who have joined us obviously either have an interest in a career in infrastructure or perhaps are already working. And so I just want to mention one very special opportunity for you to consider. Perhaps you're ready today, maybe it might be some years down the road. But San Jose State and the Minetta Transportation Institute has a fabulous graduate program in transportation management. You can either complete a Master of Science, MS in Transportation Management, or we have some graduate certificates. And the program is designed for people working full-time in the industry. So our classes meet over Zoom, just like today, but in the evenings on weeknights. We have amazing industry-leading faculty teach. Bev Scott herself, Dr. Scott, was one of our faculty for many years. And the program is also comparatively, frankly, much cheaper than probably any other graduate program you will find. And I want to stress, finally, that one of the things that I think is the best thing about our program is you will just have this amazing opportunity to explore kind of the breadth of the transportation industry and build both a broad and deep network. And that is because pretty much everybody you interact with is working doing something in transportation. We have people at public transit operators, at state DOTs, at city and county government agencies, at tech companies. We had someone who worked for an autonomous vehicle company a couple years ago, at consulting firms. So just the whole gamut. And then what people are doing is also incredibly diverse. We have bus operators. We have civil engineers, planners, federal grant managers. My first year teaching, I had a student who managed the spare parts inventory for a major rail operator. So it's really a very welcoming and appropriate degree, no matter what you are doing in transportation. And because our students come from all these diverse, perspectives, you have a great opportunity to really learn more about the industry. And are there sort of maybe different jobs that I had never thought of that I might be well suited for? And of course, you then have a network. So, and just want to highlight the photograph on this slide. Kyle Holland graduated in 2017. She works with LA Metro, where she's now a deputy executive officer. And the TAP program is the fare card program that you can use to pay your fares. So let me pause here and see if anybody has questions. I don't think any have gone into the chat yet. but please feel free.
This is great. Okay,
Shall I move on, Bev?
move on. I go ahead.
Okay.
Mhm,
All
mhm.
right. Let me just get a drink of water before I do. All right. So Act 2 of today's drama is something I've titled From Turnpikes to Fuel Taxes to the Phantom Toll Booth, Equity, Sustainability, and the Future of Road Pricing. By the way, I don't know if any of you read The Phantom Toll Booth when you were a child or perhaps as a parent or a mentor to younger kids. It is a fabulous book for, I don't know, kind of maybe middle school aged kids. And this is an illustration of Milo, the main character. So today, where I sort of want to start us thinking is, we all know, and I'm going to talk right now more about road infrastructure, and then in sort of Act 3, we'll focus more directly on transit. But road infrastructure is expensive, really expensive. So who should pay for it? And I like to think of different sort of categories of potential people, organizations that pay. So, first we have road users. So, the people who are very directly benefiting from us having our national road infrastructure. So, most obviously, that's anyone who drives, whether it's personal vehicles or companies that are transporting products or anything else over the road system. A second group, however, that has, and this is not always quite as intuitively obvious at first, a second group that really benefits greatly are property owners. And think about it, if there was no road network, nobody could easily get to your house, store, factory, whatever it is. So there is definitely a financial benefit as well as a practical benefit to property owners from having a well-developed road system. But then also, of course, ask ourselves, well, maybe we don't want just users paying. Should society at large pay? Because again, we all benefit. If there were no road system, we would have a very hard time getting, to the places we need to be, but also the, people who work at places that we go wouldn't be able to get there. And how would our economy function, et cetera? So certainly having this good transportation infrastructure is critical to everybody. So maybe everybody should pay. So that's a question to keep in the back of your mind as we continue talking today. So there are many different sources of revenue that fund roads at the federal, state, and local level. And following this idea of users versus non-users, I've kind of grouped them that way. So the things that road users pay include fuel or gasoline and diesel excise taxes. Excise taxes is kind of the fancy name. You can just think of this as the gas tax. There are sales taxes specifically on vehicles or vehicle parts or fuels. Trucks pay annual fees based on their weight, their vehicle registration fees, tolls, parking charges. Some cities have added taxes on ride hailing trips. So, and this is not an exclusive list, but gives you a good sense of what we might mean when we're talking about taxes that road users pay. In terms of property taxes, there are sort of what most people think of as property taxes. You own property, you pay, X% a year. But there are also some other structures local governments use, including fees, anytime new development is built, or sort of community benefit districts, which is a legal strategy for essentially getting a group collectively to pay for something that will be of benefit to that community. And then finally, we have the taxes that are not in any way directly linked to road users or property owners. In California, we have our carbon cap and trade program, which generates billions of dollars a year. There are business license taxes, sales and hotel taxes, and so forth. So the next sort of thing I'd like to have you think through is that and I'll explain a little more in a second, but there's a long history in the United States of road users paying not the full cost, but part of the cost to maintain and provide road infrastructure. Now, as gas taxes become less and less useful to us, one of the ideas that has been considered are mileage fees. And I like to call them phantom tolls because you don't actually have a toll booth. But are these mileage fees a good option to replace fuel tax revenue? And as I sort of explore that with you, I want to do so thinking about the themes of political feasibility, equity, and impacts on climate. So first, I'll quickly talk through kind of past and present of road user charges, introduce a little bit more of what a mileage fee means, share some research results about what the public thinks about mileage fees, and then wrap up with a few conclusions. So first, past and present of user fees. So the original user fee was tolls. This is a medieval manuscript, and it's a little hard to see, but somebody who's crossing this bridge is paying a toll. In the 20th century, we adopted a new user fee that became, nationally, it was across the country, and that's fuel taxes. So taxes on gas and diesel used for transportation. The state of Oregon was the first to adopt a gas tax, and that was in 1919. And by 1932, the federal government and all of our states charged fuel taxes. At the time they were adopted, if you go back and you read the newspapers and the kind of legislative reports and such, as this concept was debated, it was very much seen as a replacement or an equivalent for tolls, that we didn't want a toll booth at every single intersection and on our roadway. That was impractical. So this was an equivalent because the more you drove, the more fuel you bought, and thus the more fuel tax you would pay. Today, however, we have a problem, which is, fuel taxes are still alive. This cartoon is maybe a bit of exaggeration, but they are dying. They are not going to continue to provide a broad base of funding for our road infrastructure forever. And this cartoon, we could replace that 53 years. It should be more like 100 years now. It worked great for 100 years. It didn't cover everything, but it provided this huge core of funding. So I'm going to explain why fuel taxes don't have such a bright future. The first problem is one of tax structure. And, when I first started thinking about transportation funding, it sounded kind of boring and like, who cares about things like tax structures? What does that even mean? But these little policy details have enormous impact on the outcomes that so it actually became quite interesting to me to dig into all of this. So the thing to know about the fuel tax is that at the national level and at the state level, these are not set as a percentage of the price of fuel, maybe the way a sales tax is. Instead, these rates are cents per gallon. And the federal government last raised the fuel tax rate, I kid you not, in 1993. It was 18.3 cents, I believe. So this blue line at the top is showing you kind of the nominal value. So we're still paying 18.3 cents. This red line is showing you the real purchasing power of 18.3 cents. And not surprisingly, with inflation, that has gone down fast. And as a nice analogy, I like to ask everyone to think, well, if your family's income had not gone up since 1993, would you have difficulty paying your bills? And I think we all can very much appreciate that. Now, why is the excise tax structure such a problem? Because in theory, the legislature can just keep voting to raise the rate. And so it could keep going up. And to some extent, that is true. But then we get to the problem that legislators don't typically love voting to raise taxes. And this is another cartoon I love. This is our legislator and the Halloween, the gas tax is scaring him out of the room. And there certainly is a kind of conventional wisdom that voters hate the gas tax and it would be political suicide for any legislator to vote to raise it. But then, if our legislators believe that and act accordingly, we're stuck with an income that's the same thing it was, many years ago, because the tax rate isn't keeping pace with inflation. Finally, on top of all this, it's in many ways a technological benefit, but it's creating a funding problem for us. And that is because cars don't need to use as much fuel as they used to. Some of that is just very efficient cars that, maybe get 30 or 40 miles per gallon instead of the 10 or 15 or 20. And then, of course, we have electric vehicles that don't need any gas and diesel at all. And so all of these vehicle owners or users are paying somewhere between nothing and less to use the roads. So clearly something needs to be adjusted. And we don't know, we can't predict for certain, how fast a transition to electric vehicles or hyper efficient gas and diesel fuel vehicles will go. But it's pretty clear that that trend is happening, and we could reach a tipping point quicker than I think a lot of us believe. So here I just want to share with you what that might mean. And so this was a research project I did a couple years ago. We were projecting how much revenue the state of California raises from a set of 5 different taxes that are all user fees, then where the revenue is also spent directly on transportation. And we did it as a scenario because, nobody knows the future. No matter how wise and expert they are, it's always a guess. So we developed different scenarios that varied according to how much vehicle miles traveled, essentially how many miles we collectively drove each year across the state, and also how quickly we replaced gas vehicles with electric vehicles. So these are all guesses, but we tried to set it so that it was sort of a very conservative estimate, like, electric vehicles, we only gradually increase them. And then a very dramatic one, which assumed that by 2035, essentially all of our vehicles were electric. And this first image here, the gas excise tax, is the one that scares everybody. Because you can see that, and this was in about 2025, it was $7.5, $8 billion that the state raised from our own state gasoline tax, never mind the federal one. And no matter which scenario we're looking at, it goes down a lot. And in the most extreme cases where we almost entirely replace all of our vehicles with electric ones, by 2040, it's less than $1 billion. Diesel taxes don't fall off as much. The excise taxes, and these are last 2 over here are annual registration fees. And so depending on different circumstances, those will likely increase. But it's not enough to make up for that huge decline in the gas taxes. Okay, so that's the reason why we kind of need to do something, because gas taxes have been one of the core sources of revenue, packaged together with many other revenues to pay for roads. So an idea that's been talked about for many years, but has I would say the last 5 years in particularly suddenly started to get a lot more attention, is this concept of mileage fees. Again, these are meant to be sort of the phantom equivalent of tolls. You pay according to how much you drive, but without toll booths. So some questions to think through. Would this be equitable if we were to switch from fuel taxes to mileage fees? What might be the climate impacts of that change? And what does the public think? If the public is absolutely adamantly opposed, then it's unlikely that our legislators are going to be too eager to pass the laws that would be needed to make that change. So first thing to know is mileage fees are not all the same. In fact, there are many, many, many different ways we can design a mileage fee. And these are some of the key choices. The first is rate structure. We have to charge people a price. We know it's going to be a cost per mile, but is that a flat rate? Like everybody pays the same, let's say 3 pennies a mile? Or does it vary according to something like the vehicle characteristics? Certain, like maybe more polluting vehicles would pay more, less polluting would pay less. The rate could vary by the driver's characteristics, personal characteristics. The rate could vary by time. Maybe during rush hour, you paid more. And similarly, the rate could vary by place. It could be more on congested roadways, or some counties that had more expensive road needs could perhaps charge more. So there's all these different ways we could set our rates. Another key thing is to think about how often people pay. They could pay annually, which is, for example, the way we pay for vehicle registration fees. At the other extreme, they could pay at the time they buy fuel. So this could be gas or electricity. Now, that's what happens right now. Every time, I don't know how many of you listening drive a car, buy gas, but every time you buy gas, you are paying the gas tax. You just probably aren't thinking about it or even aware of it. So we could do something similar, but figuring out a way to charge people for the electricity they're using in an EV, kind of as they consume it. Or we could have some payment schedule somewhere in between, like maybe monthly. A third consideration, and one that a lot of people are very sort of worried about or interested in, is, well, track or collect the data on how many miles each vehicle has traveled. So that is critical to having, to implementing any mileage tax. So one option is to do, say, an annual odometer reading. And actually, the state of Hawaii has passed a law such that starting in, I think, around 2028 or 2030, all vehicles will pay a mileage fee. And they already have an annual vehicle inspection in Hawaii, so the odometer reading will be taken as part of that. But that's not very precise. It's just once a year. We don't know where you drove, when, anything like that. There are also options to have, equipment in your vehicle that is collecting the mileage data and transmitting it to, somebody who's going to put your bill together. There are devices that you can plug into your car that will be collecting the data and sending it off. So even if the vehicle doesn't initially come from the factory with those capabilities, you can add it pretty easily. We could trace people's cell phone movements and things like that. These different options are very important as we think about privacy considerations and what is or isn't reasonable. Finally, and this is very important for equity, how do people pay? Can they pay with literal cash? Do they have to have a bank account or a credit card? Because if it's the latter, a large fraction of Americans are so-called unbanked. They don't have a bank account or a credit card. Do we give people choices across all of these? Also, do you have, like a standalone mileage fee account? Or is your mileage fee payment sort of incorporated maybe into something else you're already paying for, like fuel or electricity? Or maybe it could be incorporated into your vehicle insurance payments or something else. And depending on what choices get made on all of these, the equity impacts, the climate impacts, and the political acceptability are all going to vary. So next, let's think about public opinion, because if everybody absolutely hated it, it's not likely to happen. And the conventional wisdom, and this has been true for a very long time, is that, oh, everybody hates road pricing. They don't like the gas tax, but this would be even worse. Politicians run the other way. But I wondered if that was true back in 2010, and I was able to start what has become an annual survey of U.S. adults that we've now done for 16 years. We actually just collected year 17 of data, although I can't share it yet, to ask adults, would you be willing to pay more for transportation at the federal level through higher gas taxes or adopting a mileage fee? These were phone surveys for a long time, although at some point that just got too expensive. And so for the last years, we've been doing online surveys. And we have at least 1,200 people who've responded each year. In recent years, it's closer to 2,500. And along with the data on their opinions about gas taxes and mileage fees, we also collected a lot of information about who was responding, like their gender or age, income, whether they owned, drove or not, did they use the bus, what kind of community did they live in, and such. I'm not going to share any of these findings today, but in our reports, we look at how opinions about gas taxes and mileage fees may vary according to all these different characteristics of the person filling out the survey. So I'm going to share just a few results from our 2025 survey, and then also show you a couple of trends that we've seen sort of over the 16 years we've been running this. So one of the key questions we ask people is about what I'm going to, as a shorthand, call our flat rate mileage fee. We say, imagine that the US Congress decides to replace the gas tax with a mileage fee of 3 cents per mile driven. That means someone driving 10,000 miles a year would pay $300. Vehicles would have an electronic meter to keep track of the miles driven. Would you support or oppose replacing the gas tax with such a mileage fee? And this year we got 44%. So not super encouraging, certainly well below majority support, although, it could be worse too. However, another question that we have asked all these years is as follows. A variation on the mileage tax just described is to have the tax rate vary depending on how much the vehicle pollutes. On average, vehicles would be charged 3 cents per mile, but vehicles that pollute less would be charged less, and vehicles that pollute more would be charged more. Would you support or oppose this new mileage tax? And this time we got 51% support. And what I want to show you next, so this is how people have answered those two questions about what I call the flat and green versions of a mileage fee, going back to 2010. And there are two key things I hope you'll take away from this. One is that the lines are going up for both of them. Over the years, they bounce around, but in general, support has gone up considerably. Like if we look at that flat rate mileage tax, when we first started, it was 22%. We've doubled that. We're now at 44%. But the second thing is that the green line is always above the yellow line. The green variant of this tax, every single year we have asked this, has been more popular with more people than the flat rate version. And actually a bit of conventional wisdom, I think, along a lot of, policymakers and staff working on mileage fee concepts is, we have to do a flat rate. That's what the public would prefer. I actually think that is likely not true. And surveys don't tell us everything, but I think our survey definitely strongly suggests that actually a flat rate might not be the best option from a political acceptability opinion. Now, I next want to share just two more findings from the survey, and they relate to thinking about equity and, the hardship that low-income families face in paying for anything, but certainly including, costs related to driving, like a mileage fee. So we asked a question about something that I, as a shorthand, will call a block rate fee structure. So we said, if Congress creates a federal mileage fee, which of the following possible fee structures would be fairer? The fee is the same for every mile the vehicle drives during the year. The fee is lower for the first 5,000 miles the vehicle drives during the year, and higher for all additional miles driven that year. And we get a 50-50 split. Now, the reason that I think this block rate option is really important to consider is because on average, low income families do not drive as many miles a year as higher income families. There are going to be exceptions to any generality like this, but it is a very clear trend. And it's obvious. If you're very low income, you can't afford to be driving all over the place, regardless of whether you're paying a gas tax or not. So block rate option like this would mean that low income vehicle owners would be able to pay that low rate for many of the miles they're driving. And from a sort of government perspective, we don't have to worry about verifying people's incomes or anything like that. But another option we certainly could do is simply offering a lower rate to low income drivers. So we asked, if Congress adopts a mileage fee, would you support or oppose charging a lower rate to low income drivers? And we got very clear support for this, 63%. And that has been pretty stable over a number of years. It kind of goes up and down, but it's always over 60%. Oh, one other thing is we did ask people how often they would like to pay, which I see as a very important equity consideration, because if you're low income, it's very hard to pay a big lump sum bill once a year. So we asked about if they preferred annual, monthly payments, or each time they buy gas or charge their EV. Only a quarter of people preferred the annual bill. Everybody else preferred more frequent payments, and the most popular among the options was like these little mini payments every time you buy gas or charge EV. One other last thing here, and I'm turning now to survey questions we asked about raising the gas tax rate. And we asked about support for different variations on a 10-cent per gallon increase in the federal gas tax rate. And what's important is the way we varied it is we asked people if they would support that increase with the money dedicated for different kinds of purposes. So this yellow line at the bottom is when we told people, hey, would you support raising the rate just to pay for transportation? And we didn't give people any more information. In all the others, which are all higher, we specified what the money would be used for. And year after year, the most popular is maintenance and safety. By the way, engineers tend to worry a lot about maintenance and safety. So this should make their hearts glad. They are in alignment with the public in thinking that that really matters. So what I take away from this is that even though this is asking about gas taxes, if we want the public to support a mileage fee, we had better be sure that we make it clear that that money will be spent on things people value, like safety and maintenance. So just to wrap this up, how equitable would it be to replace fuel taxes with mileage fees? It depends on all kinds of choices about how that fee program is set up. But some good options to make a program more equitable are to reduce the costs for low-income drivers. And you could either do this with an income-based rate discount or that block rate structure I proposed, and also essentially allow people to make small, frequent payments. In terms of climate, again, it depends, but the rate structure, again, matters a lot. If we choose a rate structure that is higher for gas guzzlers, for example, and lower for more efficient vehicles, we're sending people a price signal that encourages them to maybe buy a more fuel efficient vehicle, which would be, of course, much better for our climate. And the flat rate, on the other hand, does not send that signal. And then finally, how we spend the revenue also has an enormous impact on climate. So we could dedicate some portion of the money to what you might call climate-friendly transportation options, like, oops, that's supposed to say transit. I'll fix that before I email you the slides, or EV charging facilities or bike lanes or whatever. Finally, public acceptance. Again, it depends on the program design. But in 2025, that green mileage fee had 51% support. And support has been rising. And looking at the gas tax survey findings, it shows pretty clearly that people are more supportive in general, I think, of taxes for transportation if the money is spent on maintenance and safety, among other things. So I do think that this can be designed to be more and less and perhaps overall acceptable to the majority. I know the slides will be shared later, and so this is just links to a number of different resources where you can learn more, including the studies that I've worked on that I just described. So with that, let's take a short break. I'll actually just stop sharing my slides for a second and questions from
This is fascinating. I tell you, and some of them you've really kind of answered, but I'm gonna go through them anyway.
Mhm.
About one was how does the cap and trade financing work? Okay.
So I'm not a deep expert on that, but
Okay.
essentially it's the idea that factories, power plants, if you release carbon emissions, you have to buy essentially a permit for each ton of carbon emissions that you emit. And these can be traded. And
Okay.
so so if it's going to cost me $100 to reduce a ton of carbon
I
emissions,
got you.
but Bev, it only costs you $50. Maybe you sell me your permits for
You're
75.
per
Right.
I got it. I
Yes. And
got it.
now the
Okay.
money is a big pot at the state level, and then each year the legislature decides how to spend that.
How to do. Okay. Okay. Now here's another one. And you have done so much research on this. How much of the problem do you feel is because there is a big gap between public understanding and reality about what everything really costs? So that's a lot. But
Yeah.
just yeah, this is fascinating research you've been doing. But what is your feeling on that? Still a gap.
I, you know, in other kinds of surveying or focus groups, or if you listen to like public events where community members talk about this, there's always a pretty large core of people who say, well, just be more efficient. Government,
Mhm.
they can just, if they don't waste money, they can pay for everything with the money they already have. I personally believe two things. We could be more efficient. Like, I
Yeah.
firmly believe that, but that would never save us enough money to provide the kinds of good quality transit and road systems we want.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's very hard when you get to thinking about paying for something like public infrastructure because the amounts of money, first of all, they're enormous. Like most of us don't think in terms of millions and billions of
Mhm.
dollars. And yet, like, that's kind of the scale of thinking when
Mhm.
you're talking about
Mhm.
transportation. And then the other thing is people honestly have no idea what specific, building this or
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
costs.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
And
so
some of that, I guess, is in that even in terms of how we term things like a freeway. Okay. And I'm saying, well, there is no
yeah,
freeway.
there's
Okay. And
no
I'm saying,
freeway.
I mean, it's just crazy. Okay. So we
Yeah.
kind of gotten ourselves in this conundrum. And then I want to let the last one is this is a opinion. Where
Yeah.
do you see the most significant equity failures? What do you see the most significant equity failures are in how we currently fund the system we have today? Okay.
hmm
Okay.
Um, so if you're looking at the gas tax
Mm-hmm.
specifically, um, one of the equity things, which again I think is an issue, but less than people often think, is well, you pay more in gas tax if you have a less fuel efficient vehicle. And and
Yeah.
and older vehicles on average do tend to be less efficient than new
Yep.
vehicles. And so people assume that, low income residents are all paying like more per gallon of gas in taxes or more per mile traveled in gas taxes. That is
Okay.
true, but it is also less of a difference than a lot of people imagine. We looked at data and it is a little older now. So the gap
Mm-hmm.
could have increased actually, but we
Mm-hmm.
looked at the fuel efficiency of like every a sample of households in California and their income. And we found that the difference was on average like 4 miles per gallon. So
Okay.
it's
Okay.
there, but it's,
Yeah,
I think some people imagine it's double or
much bigger.
something like that.
Mm-hmm. 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 Mm-hmm.
And then, we do charge users directly through gas
Mm-hmm.
taxes, tolls, all these
Mm-hmm.
things. And
Mm-hmm.
for the most part, they're not discounts based
Mm-hmm.
on income. And so then that becomes an interesting kind of theoretical,
Mm-hmm.
values laden discussion
Kind of
about
piece.
should
Mm-hmm.
users pay or not. And depending on where you fall on that, you may
Mm-hmm.
consider our user fee system equitable or not.
Yeah, yeah. That's really almost something that you say from a principle standpoint. Before we start doing anything, have we as a nation really come to grips with, from a value standpoint, no right or wrong,
Hmm.
where do we want to be? And it would seem to me then if once you get that
Hmm.
set, okay,
Hmm.
then it becomes easier, okay, to be able
Hmm.
to go through the different choices. But that's like a central, well, that's a central question for this current, but the next gen, okay, and I'm saying because honestly, whatever the results of all of the what it is, because clearly we stay in crisis, it is going, this is a next gen resolution issue. Okay. And I'm saying, so this is fascinating. No, fascinating. Those are the ones that I had in the queue. And so go right ahead, Ash. I'm just writing
Okay.
notes. I'm writing
All
notes.
right. Let me share my screen again
Okay.
and take another sip of water and get started.
Okay.
So, Act 3 of today's drama, I've titled A History of Paying for Public Transit in the US. And I think this is very important, sort of as a context, to help us think through where we go in the future. Which, and by the way, the next presentation in this series, I know is going to be Sharon Green, who is an expert on like what are we doing today to pay for
Right.
things. So this is
Mhm.
setting up her presentation. Alexandra, you had your hand up.
That was an accident,
Oh,
but
okay.
I just wanted you to know after this there is a question in the Q&A box. So
Oh, let me look there. Thank you.
Okay.
Let's see, where did it go? And thank you for pointing that out. Okay. My question is, what are some approaches for public transit agencies to fund more innovative or pilot style programs? That
Okay.
is more of a Sharon question than an Asha question. So I encourage you to check back with the next one and definitely ask Sharon Green. Um, but I think that, part of it is just making the choice to carve some money out of your budget to experiment. And that's
Mhm.
hard to do when we are facing a fiscal cliff at many transit agencies and they're worried about having to like cut service and lay off employees. But these pilot programs are usually so cheap. They're like such a
Mhm.
tiny part of the overall budget that it maybe makes sense to do at least some of them. But that is a very, very good question. Um,
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
think
Mhm.
sometimes there might also be a possibility of getting like foundations to contribute to the cost. They sometimes see this essentially as a research and they want to kind of seed the research to see if we can find a long-term good solution.
Mhm. 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 I
Okay.
definitely agree with you. I mean, it, it, some of the best work have been those trailblazers who've been able to get out there to actually test it. Okay, and I'm saying, and so, I mean that you having the live demos is just it makes a big difference. Okay,
Yes.
yeah.
It's sort of the live demo, just if I may make a tiny thing about transportation careers and how people discover them. I have been always interested in how planners and civil engineers choose transportation as opposed to housing or water or
Hmm.
something else. And an enormous percentage of us, or of the people I talk to, tell me a variant on, well, I grew up driving everywhere I went. And then I went on vacation and you can plug in a European country, Japan,
Yeah,
Singapore, China, and I suddenly saw that you didn't have to drive everywhere and it was convenient and clean and safe and it was great. And I wanted to have a career helping bring that to the US. So
yeah,
I often wish we could send every American for a week vacation with a transit pass to one of those countries. I
yeah,
think if we could do that, we'd have so much more support at home because once you
absolutely.
experience it, you see.
You see it. Okay.
Okay,
Thank you.
so yes, the premise for sort of this last piece of what I want to talk about is that these community public transit services we want don't cover their costs through fares. By the way, drivers are not covering their costs either through user fees. I just want to lay that out. But we're here to now to talk about transit. So how do we pay for it? There has to be somebody subsidizing transit by somebody. I mean, society at large, essentially. And because I'm a folklore and mythology major, I sometimes like to think in terms of fairies. So what I want to talk to you today about is to make the argument that there has always been a fairy godmother helping pay for the gap between what the service actually costs to provide and
Thank you.
the fare that the revenue raised from users. And
Yeah.
transit operators sometimes have a few other ways to raise revenue, like advertising or whatever.
Hmm.
So who has that fairy godmother been? By the way, I like definitions and dictionaries, so I looked up fairy godmother and discovered it is a generous friend or benefactor, according to Merriam-Webster. So, my sort of 3 points I'll run through. First, does the public know about transit's fairy godmother? Who has the fairy been, and sort of in the past, and then today, who is the fairy? So, first, let's go to does the public realize that there's this godmother floating around and providing money to transit services? So, I did a poll. It was a different one than I talked about a few minutes ago, but it was another national survey of adults, and this was in 2017. And we asked, well, we said slash asked, when people ride public transit, they pay a fare. This money is used to pay for the service. Do you think that the money collected from public transit fares in general covers the full cost of the service? And here's what we found 31%. So a third said, yes, my fares or whoever's paying the fares, that fully covers the service. 58% said no. Those were the people who were correct that there is got to be a fairy godmother. And then 11% said they didn't know. So actually, I took encouragement from the fact that at least half people did understand that there has to be some kind of subsidy. But a whole lot of people incorrectly think that their fares are covering everything. We then followed up and asked people if they knew where the money came from, the federal government, the state, and the local. I didn't use the word fairy in the survey, by the way, but for the sake of this presentation, have done so. And 41% of people thought, of the people who knew that there was some subsidies, the most thought that the state was paying, and that was 51%, and then around 40-ish% thought there was a federal and or a local ferry. So let's now turn to thinking about who have these actual fairy godmothers been. But before that, let's remind ourselves what is the origin of public transit? And at least as far as I know, it was first introduced, what we would think of as a modern public transit system where you have a scheduled route and people can pay fares to ride along that route. It was in 1662 in Paris by somebody named Blaise Pascal. He, by the way, was a French mathematician. My father is a mathematician, so I like to think that Blaise Pascal, who was a mathematician and created a transit service, is kind of like, both my dad and I can connect with him. At any rate, King Louis XIV granted Pascal a monopoly to have horse-drawn vehicles running along regular routes in Paris and paying passengers. It did not last long. the Parliament of Paris, um, well, the Parliament of Paris banned so-called commoners from riding on the vehicles. They were trying to keep it just for the aristocracy. And also you had probably so-called commoners interfering with the vehicles. They were annoyed about them or mad that they couldn't use them. You had police beating the commoners who were interfering with the vehicles, and the whole system got shut down after just a few years. Fortunately, we have figured out how to run public transit more successfully in later centuries. So, turning to our fairy godmothers in the US, um, the first thing I want to stress is there has always been a fairy godmother. This is not a new
Mhm.
thing. This is just the way transit
It
has
is.
operated.
Mhm.
So, in the United States, the first transit systems were essentially built to connect suburban communities to downtown business districts. And these were
Mhm.
all built, these transit systems, by real estate developers. So remember how I
Mhm.
said at the beginning that if there is no road system or transportation, your property is not very valuable? Well, this is a
Mhm.
great example of that. Nobody was going to build their house or buy a house out in the suburbs at the time if there was no convenient way to get into town. People then didn't have cars. Most people couldn't afford horses and carts and all. So the real estate developers subsidize building and operating these transit services. Essentially, you could think of it as like a loss leader to get people to buy all these suburban homes. Now, eventually, the real estate developers kind of lost interest in this because they were done selling their homes. And so now now they were sort of losing money on these services, but it wasn't clear to them that they were getting a benefit. But a new ferry appeared, and it was the electric utilities. And this was around the 1920s. And two of the reasons why the utilities got interested. The first one kind of makes sense, which is that by then streetcars were primarily running on electricity. So if you're the electric utility, then you usually have access to cheap electricity so it sort of reduces your costs compared to maybe what a real estate developer would need to pay. But the other thing, which is probably frankly more influential, had to do with anti-monopoly law in the country. And so federal law said that utilities, because they were, a monopoly, the profits that they could make were capped at a percentage of the value of their assets. So if you're an electric utility, the only way to increase your profit is to increase your assets. You have to become a bigger company. So they had this strong incentive there to go out and buy more whatever, and the street railways worked well in many communities. Then moving into the 30s, you started then there was a federal legislation actually that sort of anti-monopoly that said, wait, you big companies, you can't own like the streetcars and the power, and it's too much, it's a monopoly, you need to break up. And so then the auto and the bus industry and tire manufacturers and some, sort of other industries kind of stepped in, bought these services, in some cases started replacing streetcars with bus services. And then we kind of went along, and then World War II came. And you may not know it, but transit was absolutely critical to the US war effort. And that was because they were running factories 24 hours a
Yeah.
day, building, manufacturing weapons and, just products, consumer products, and people had to get to work. And so these systems were just, the transit systems were ground down. They were just running 24 hours. So then the war ended, and the systems were like really in need of repair. Like they had been sort of worn to the ground. Meanwhile, the 50s, and when we start having more and more people moving to suburban areas and buying automobiles, so there were fewer people who were reliant on transit services. And so these across the country, these services, these public transit companies, because they were still private companies, were just like they were going to go bankrupt or just abandoned it. So we had a new fairy godmother, and now we bring in government. So starting in the 50s, local governments, they could see, if I have no transit system, what is going to happen to my economy, let alone sort of the ability of, people to access the services they need. So local governments started buying these failing transit companies. But then they were struggling to pay the costs. And so in the 60s, and this is not until the 1960s, the federal government started providing a certain amount of money to local governments to cover transit costs. So that was sort of the 60s and the 70s. And then starting in like the 80s, many states got into the game as well. And so today, let's see, okay. So just to wrap this up, so the key point is there have always been ferries. They were private sector ferries for a long time, more than 50 years. And then as demand for transit fell, the service became very expensive because it needed massive repairs. Local, federal, and state governments stepped in. Okay, so that's sort of the history. So since money doesn't grow on trees, where do we get it today? Who's our fairy godmother? So my facetious answer is nobody knows. It's magic. Actually, the nobody knows is close to true. It
Yeah.
is a Byzantine, complicated mess that very, very few people understand, even people who work in the industry. And most agencies rely on a package of many different sources of revenue, sometimes dozens of them. And
To make it very.
every agency does it differently. So it's very confusing. And this is similar to the slide that I showed you early, but we have, these are some of the different sources. So there are things that the transit operators themselves raise, fares and advertising revenue. Many of the sort of vehicle user fees, some portion of that money is sometimes used to support transit, and then states rely on all, and local governments rely on all kinds of other sources of sort of general fund revenue. So, how much today in California does each of these ferries, state, local, and federal, give? I actually didn't find something more recent than 2017 when I was looking, but I don't think the picture has changed
It's changed that much.
dramatically. So I decided, even though I feel a little embarrassed to show you a slide that ends in 2017, I thought it was still worth it. So this is for California transit only. And it is the share of total funding that comes from federal passenger fares and then local, state, and federal money. So the green over here is the passenger fares. Everything to the right of the green is the ferries. And you will see that the most generous ferry by far is this big yellow block in the middle, which is local governments, cities, counties, sometimes regional organizations.
Regional.
The state has put in a very small share. Oh, by the way, I should emphasize this is transit operations. So that is important. So this is paying the drivers, paying the planners to plan, the engineers to fix the rails, just the sort of running the service. It's not building new infrastructure or buying new transit vehicles. Those are considered capital expenses.
Capital.
So this is just the operations. And then the federal government, puts in roughly a quarter. So that's kind of who our ferries are at a broad stroke right now. So just to summarize all this, and then we can turn to some more questions. I want to stress there's been quite a crowd of ferries over the years. We had our various different private firms, companies, the land developers, the electric utilities, the auto and bus industry. And then we did switch over to government, federal, local, and state. So in summary, the public transit services that we want, I would argue that we need in our communities, have just always required funding beyond what users pay. And this is similar to all kinds of other public services, like roads, by the way, and schools. We I think, consider it pretty normal and appropriate that families do not have to pay for them to go to public schools. That is, public schools are a public benefit that we as a society benefit from. And so it's appropriate to provide those to everybody at no cost. So we're going to need a new ferry. And this is also around the world. There are very, very few examples of transit operators that are not subsidized by their governments. There are a few examples like Hong Kong, which is incredibly dense, so huge ridership, and legally, I believe in Hong Kong as an example, the transit agency can be a property developer. So they build like huge high rises and office buildings on their land. And so a lot of the revenue they're getting is actually not from the fares. I mean, the fares are also, substantial, but they're getting this rents and other profits from their real estate. Okay, so when the private sector ferries in the US lost interest, the public sector stepped in. Today, state and especially local governments in California certainly are the largest supporters of our transit services. Every agency relies on just this incredibly complicated mix of sources that very few people understand. And I want to stress even people who work in the industry. But one of the things that I didn't talk about much, and I'm guessing Sharon Green may speak about, is sales tax revenue. In California, especially at the county level, voters have approved what we call local option sales taxes for transportation. And these are often, absolutely essential to funding our buses and trains. So some sort of questions for everybody to think about for next generation is going to have to pick up and answer for us is, first of all, what's the appropriate proportion of local, state, and federal support? Secondly, we have this very complicated system right now. It has benefits and it has drawbacks. Do we want to stick with this? Do we want to try and find a simpler system? And then finally, the local governments are already raising, the majority of the fairy godmother donations, but they are severely limited by state law in what kinds of taxes and fees they can collect.
Right.
And so then should the state of California, and in other states it's similar, should the state change its laws to give local and regional governments more flexibility to raise their own revenue? Because, and I think right now, nobody expects the federal government's going to sweep in and fix the deficits our transit operators face. That's going to be state and local. And do the states really want to keep kind of tying the hands of local governments such that even when communities are willing to pay more, legally, your county, your city can't take advantage of that source of revenue? And with that, as with my previous Act 2, my slides will include some things if you want to read and learn a bit more about, some opportunities to do that. And so with that, I will stop sharing and once again see if Bev or any of our other panelists, guests have questions.
Okay. Well, I'm going to weigh in a little bit, and I'm going to age myself because as you were talking about the transitions, within the transitions, there have been significant. I'm almost 50 years in this industry now. When I started out in 1977, I'm so glad you brought up the operating capital. The operating cost that we received was at almost 70 to 80% coming federal. And you're quite right. I have seen, not as extensive as yours, but I've seen some data sets. And in that whole, it's been a tremendous, a sea change shift of what's taken place over the last 50-year period of time. Definitely state and local, but really local coming to be it really is the one that's taking the burden of it. Okay. And I'm saying, well, just taking the cost. And so all of this, it's just, and people really not understanding this whole hodgepodge of what's been kind of put together to kind of make it work. So the question that hits too, that's up in here. So could you go through a little bit, because now you're really seeing and hearing so much about the transit funding crisis coming out of COVID. I mean, there's any newspaper you pick up over the last 18 months to 2 years has had some horror story or another about true transit system. So what actually was it, a deferred thing? How much of it was really COVID? Just your perspectives on that, Asha, because that's one of the questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's complicated. And
Yeah.
again, I my own expertise is more at the kind of big picture
Hmm.
policy level. Again, I'm guessing, Bev, you have great answers to that
Yeah.
question. Sharon Green will next year. But to try and so first of all, transit operators lost a lot of passengers during
Yeah.
COVID. And in some communities, fare revenue covered a fair amount of the operating expense. So in the Bay
Hmm.
Area, I'll use BART, and it's our heavy rail system. I think something in the order of like
Oh
56%
yeah. Yeah. They
of
were a leader.
and
Yeah.
they were
Hmm.
and this is the important part. Everyone's like, oh, BART is such a model. They're
I know.
raising so much of
Hmm.
their own money. They're not relying as, higher proportion of
Yep.
subsidies.
Yep.
Well, when you lose all your riders, if they were
Hmm.
providing half of your revenue, it is suddenly a revenue crisis. Whereas
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
I am a critical, like rural bus operator that was only
Hmm.
collecting 5% of my revenue or 10% from fares
Hmm.
anyway, if I
Hmm.
lose some of that fare revenue, it didn't really matter as much. So I think
Hmm.
the loss in ridership is critical. And after COVID, things have changed, like where people live and work. And so some of the ridership has come back, but you have some people who are now working remotely. So they
Hmm.
maybe used to take transit and maybe either they never commute or maybe they commute twice a week, whereas they used to do
Hmm.
5 days a week. You have people who just moved out of cities altogether, and are,
Hmm.
living in places where transit is not an option. So the pain, this sort of crisis of transit funding is not the same across the country. Agency by agency, it just varies, and sort of region by region. But in
Hmm.
general, the crisis seems to be worse for big kind of central
Big
city
operators.
operators,
Mhm.
and especially for the ones that got all the, applause prior to COVID because
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
they relied less on their fairy godmothers. So,
Yeah, yeah. Now, what do you have in your surveying? Have you asked? There's been a lot that's come up about whether or not fares should really, whether it should just be free fares. Now, this is in the midst of what you just talked about. We were just talking about in terms of the crisis, but people have said, like, should there just be free fares? Okay. Any perspectives that you have on that? And have you had a chance to survey that one yet? Okay.
so that is a good question.
Okay.
So we have not, I don't think, in general, I have not focused on that in the surveys.
Okay. Okay.
I will actually look, and I might have a small contribution to that conversation that I could share later.
Okay.
But from and again, Dr. Scott, you probably have want to
Yeah.
share too. I'm actually not a huge fan of free fares. First of all,
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
everybody needs it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And do we really want, maybe we're better off having lower cost or free fares for the people for whom it is a hardship to pay the fare.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's one
Mm-hmm.
reason. And then another is, in many ways, free fares are great, but they also, in some places, can lead to severe crowding. And then the agency just has less money to
Yep.
pay for that.
Yep.
In some communities, you may see more people using transit as shelter, because
Mm-hmm.
they have nowhere
Mm-hmm.
else to be that's safe,
Mm-hmm.
warm, and not
Mm-hmm.
in the rain. So,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
then other passengers are sometimes uncomfortable because of this. So, and then the last
Yeah.
thing is if we can afford for our fairy godmother, and I think this is really important, if we have the money to increase the amount of fairy godmother dollars to transit,
Right.
do we
Right.
want to spend that making fares free, or do we want to spend that making the service better? And
So
I
now I'm
think,
gonna come, yep.
okay,
I'm
let me
gonna
turn it
come
to you.
in. So everybody know people are saying, what's she gonna say? Okay.
Mhm.
I've never really been a proponent for free fares either. And I tell you what, I'll be a proponent of free fares when we're prepared to wind up putting the money in public transportation to make it a system of first choice and not one of last resort. Okay.
Yeah.
My fear is some of the things you've just said, that we really duck what is the fundamental issue. One of the biggest reason that, you have things that work other places is because from a policy standpoint, from a what are we going to be, they have built systems of first choice or certainly competitive.
Mhm.
Okay. Where too often for us, it's not that it's a totally across the board, but too often we've really through the years didn't start out that way. Okay. But it really became more the default. Okay. And that is, in my estimation, really part of the crux of the issue. Okay. And I'm saying, so that's kind of how I come on the free fares. Let's focus on what the issue really, really is. Okay. Because anyway, if so, I don't want to
Yeah.
start, you could get me off and then we will never finish this, but and
Well, let
it's hard to say it, okay,
Mhm.
because I also really understand the affordability issue,
Mhm.
but I think I don't even think this focus on the donut in this one, which is that we've got to be challenging ourselves to really make public transit what it really is for Lifeline and lifestyle. Okay. So that's kind of
and
where I come out.
And actually, a couple of quick thoughts to build on top of that. There's quite a bit of research asking people over the years in different parts of the country, like, what improvements would you value most to transit service? And there'll be options like lower fares, more
Mhm.
frequent service,
Yeah.
expanding the service. Even for very low income people responding to those surveys, better quality service
Better
is
quality.
typically,
Yep.
and I mean, no matter what your income, if it's not safe, if it doesn't run where you need to be, it's not helping
Exactly.
you.
It's not
So,
helping. It's not
yeah.
helping. That's it. And then the fares, you brought up about the transit operations and maintenance, and I think the only additional contributor I would probably say on that is that when the federal government made a very back in the 90s, candidly, it was like in the beginning of the 90s, they made a really big distinction for public transit, if you will, and stopped paying just the way they had been for operating money. And so they turned it to be much more of a focus on capital. Okay. And particularly for the larger, well, absolutely for the larger and the mid-sized systems, the rural and the smaller operators. And that was very, very major. Okay. And then we started getting into this whole thing. I won't go there, preventive maintenance and all that kind of stuff. That was a sea change for transit. So adding to what the data that you showed, when you really start looking at how much of the infrastructure is really paid by which one, the capital piece makes a big difference because yes, you'll see the federal dollars come in, but still with big heavy on transit. And one of the biggest equity issues is that we don't treat all the modes the same. Okay, so you have transit that's sitting up on big capital programs and basically don't even get in the game if you're not prepared to put in about 50%. And then on the highway side, more on the roads and stuff, it's been more this whole 80-20. So within our own domain, if you will, transportation, on that issue of what are the principles, what are the values that are going to drive us, we've actually set up pretty historically from the time we got in a big table, little table thing. Okay. And so there's just so much that just needs to be kind of unbundled there. But a
Mhm.
lot of comes again, and thank you so much. And that's why we're in this, because if you can't if you don't know what you don't know, okay, then what winds up happening is that it just continues to become more complicated. And when you start saying to yourself, oh, I didn't even realize that that's how it all worked. Okay. When you started out with that first slide that would ask the question, who is paying for the ride? Okay, and I'm saying,
Mhm.
and Lord, after 50 years and 9 systems, every time without failure, okay, board members coming aboard, private sector doesn't understand it. Folks really don't understand that public transit has always had a fairy godmother. I can't, and now there've had to be many more fairy godmothers to get into it. So why don't we just fix it? Okay. Do you have anything that this has just been absolutely fascinating. I want to say that we get to our topics every year that we put as the framing ones. You can't talk about everything with career awareness. We actually ask the participants in our program, which includes the young people who have been in the program, okay, help us to decide what will be we don't take any more than two, the big issues that are industry-wide significance that we need to focus on. And swear to God, neck and neck this year came transportation funding and finance, okay, and the other one was the whole issue of technology, transit impacts on transit of technology, and a lot on autonomous vehicles, which is what we'll be focusing on in May. But I can't thank you. We just can't thank you enough. And as everybody knows, these recordings will, if you want the recording, we'll be happy to send it to you. For those who are in our program, they just go into shared resources. Okay. But our interest is in making sure that that the public is served, that people know, okay, and that you get interested or more interested in these careers, because just think of the what we've talked about today. It absolutely connects to what's important about this is people and communities, okay? And so the funding aspect of transportation is absolutely critical. Everybody knows that's in the program what we do on July 31st as we launch into the Innovation Challenge weekend. Every one of these sessions that we have, we will start off with our career awareness trivia contest.
Mm-hmm.
So Asha, I've been making notes over here in terms of what will be the magic questions that will come out of this session. But no, we have a lot of fun. And so the youth that are participating during that weekend, they kick off with the Career Awareness Trivia Contest. I want to thank the American Public Transportation Association very much for being our sponsor, because that night, some enterprising young person who's looked at all these will win $1,000 when they answer the questions. Okay, and I'm saying, so we don't want to make everything be monetary, but if you want to binge on them, weekend, just go for it. But no, it's just been wonderful. Anything else you want to add, Asha? We're just thrilled.
I would just say that, encouraging anyone who's thinking of starting or sort of deepening a career in transportation, first of all, there are so many things you can do in the industry, and so it's always possible to find something that fits your skills and what you care about.
Yeah.
Secondly, it is enormously rewarding because you are helping your community, people just live basic good lives.
Yeah.
And don't be afraid to explore things that might seem kind of dull and whatever. Like, I never thought I would spend 30 years thinking about gas taxes. Like, when
I'm telling you.
I was hired as a research assistant. It was a job. I was like, okay, fine, I'll work on that. And I came to discover that it's fascinating and I care about it, and other people do too, actually.
Yeah. Well, when you were giving your story, some many have heard mine. I fell into public transportation in 1976. I was minding my business, teaching government and public affairs at Tennessee State University, and there was this Carnegie Eastern Urban Fellows program that a former professor of mine sent me and said, thought you might be interested. And it was before Houston Metro even was a Houston Metro, and the rest of it is history. So, I mean, that kind of there's a lot more intentionality now. Thank you for the Mineta Transportation Institutes and the San Jose State Universities and stuff. But still, many people, that's the story. I didn't, but it's because of the adjacencies. It's because of what outcomes. That's why we call it's all about community building. I always tell people we don't sell infrastructure. It's really about community building. Well, everybody, thank you so much. You have to tune in. The second part of is Sharon Green. Okay. And now Asha's talked and she's given a tremendous foundation here. Now Sharon is going to be talking about now how do we make all that work in the community? Okay. And I'm saying she's going to be talking about decision making and who makes decisions and how they are. And then there are a couple of questions that have been specifically asked, like on the sales. She's going to be talking about exactly what Asha was saying. Well, a lot of this money is now coming from these local referendum. Okay. And so she will be able to kind of help put that together, and you just couldn't ask for a better person. So when we always go to get the best. So there you go. So thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure, and we will see you. We'll see you next week for Transportation Funding Finance 102. Thank you so much.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
for the invitation.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.